Summer 1945. As the war in Europe concluded, the full might of the Allied powers turned its gaze toward Japan. An invasion was meticulously planned. Operation Olympic, the first phase, was scheduled for November. But behind the maps and troop movements, a profound and agonizing debate unfolded within the highest echelons of the American government. At its core was a stark calculation: the human cost. President Truman and his advisors were wrestling with projections of unprecedented American casualties. This fixation on casualties became the explicit criterion for reviewing any invasion strategy. Initially, there was an assessment of Japan's defensive capabilities that seemed manageable. But then, the highly classified intercepts from the Ultra intelligence system began to paint a radically different picture. Ultra revealed that American intelligence had significantly underestimated the strength and resolve of the Japanese forces awaiting invasion. Japan was not collapsing. It was preparing for a desperate final stand. This intelligence upheaval cast a long shadow over Operation Olympic. Some within the military hierarchy were suspected of suppressing lower casualty estimates, preferring to present data that underscored the immense human cost to justify the extraordinary measures now being considered. The perceived lack of any credible path to unconditional surrender, other than a full-scale invasion or a new, terrible weapon, was a constant refrain. Japan's political structure, with its powerful military faction, and the emperor's deeply symbolic but often constrained role, seemed to offer no clear avenue for negotiation. The leadership was reluctant to accept truly unconditional terms. This created an impasse that the atomic bomb, once developed, was seen as capable of breaking. Decades later, historians continued to scrutinize the casualty figures presented to Truman. Some argue that earlier estimates, though still substantial, were lower than the dramatic figures often cited in post-war justifications. For example, while President Truman later recalled figures ranging from 250,000 to over 1 million American casualties, contemporary Joint Chiefs of Staff reports offered a broader range. The precise number of lives that would have been lost in an invasion remains a subject of intense academic debate. However, at the time, the consistent message reaching President Truman was one of catastrophic loss. This backdrop of immense projected casualties was critical to the context in which the orders were issued to use atomic weapons. The first atomic bomb, Little Boy, dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, was a turning point. It introduced a new dimension of warfare and destruction. 3 days later, on August 9th, the second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. This second strike was not gratuitous. It was deemed necessary to counter any belief within the Japanese leadership that the United States possessed only a single weapon or that it would be deterred from further use. The very rhythm of these bombings was intended to convey a relentless, overwhelming power. Even after these devastating attacks and the Soviet Union's entry into the war, the emperor's intervention was still required to break the deadlock within the Japanese leadership. His decision to accept surrender was influenced by a confluence of factors: fear of domestic upheaval, the unprecedented power of the atomic bomb, and the inescapable threat of a conventional invasion. A common misconception is that Japan's surrender was imminent through diplomacy alone. However, magic intercepts, which provided insights into Japanese leadership's communications, reveal that key leaders were not willing to accept truly unconditional surrender until faced with overwhelming force. Foreign Minister Togo's rejection of terms that allowed only the retention of the imperial institution demonstrates this resolve. Another historical debate concerns the emperor's role. Contrary to the idea that Emperor Hirohito was eager for surrender throughout 1945, evidence suggests his initial support was for continued resistance and a desire for a negotiated settlement rather than outright capitulation on Allied terms. His ultimate intervention for peace was a complex decision, born of immense pressure. In the end, the atomic bombings, alongside the relentless strategic bombing and naval blockade, brought about Japan's surrender, avoiding a potentially devastating ground invasion that would have claimed millions more lives on both sides. It is also important to consider a grim alternative scenario often discussed by historians. The strategic bombing and blockade strategy, without the atomic bombs, would likely have led to a catastrophic famine in Japan. This long-term loss of life could have ultimately exceeded even the horrific immediate casualties of the atomic bombings. The decision to employ these weapons remains one of the most debated and morally complex acts of the 20th century. It brought an end to the deadliest conflict in human history, but at a cost that continues to challenge our understanding of war, ethics, and the difficult choices made in moments of ultimate crisis. This lingering uncertainty of the war's final brutal calculus, it speaks to the horrific choices made, especially regarding the projected human cost of a homeland invasion. President Truman identified casualties as the decisive criterion for invasion strategy approval. General Marshall, a towering figure, warned Truman of potential difficulties in obtaining a formal capitulation. He recognized the need for an invasion, even of Tokyo itself. Marshall also presented low-end ground casualty projections, suggesting around 31,000 for the first 30 days of Olympic. Yet, even he later balked at pressing numbers over 100,000 for that operation. Admiral King, intriguingly, did not challenge the silence on air and naval casualties during the invasion strategy review. However, he privately expressed unease to Marshall, concerned that Truman had not been informed of Nimitz's projection of 49,000 casualties in the first 30 days. This disparity highlights a profound intelligence gap, or perhaps a deliberate downplaying of the true cost. Ultra-intelligence, a critical advantage, would soon dramatically reveal that Japanese defenses on Kyushu exceeded original estimates by more than 3 times in combat divisions. It showed 2 to 4 times more aircraft than anticipated, fundamentally altering all prior casualty projections. At a pivotal meeting on June 18, 1945, Truman reviewed the invasion strategy, with casualties indeed serving as the decisive criterion. Yet, only the low-end projections were presented that day. Secretary Stimson, understanding the looming price, authorized a study confirming the need for induction and replacement training capacity for truly massive casualties. His aide, Edward L. Bowles, commissioned Shockley's dire casualty estimates. Shockley's report, appearing in July 1945, painted a truly grim picture: potential U.S. casualties of 1.7 to 4 million, including 400,000 to 800,000 fatalities. He also projected Japanese deaths between 5 to 10 million. These figures emerged just as ultra-intelligence began destroying prior projection assumptions. General MacArthur, though later downplaying the invasion's cost, had an intelligence officer, Charles Willoughby, who noted that Ultra revealed Japanese defenses were significantly underestimated, leading to odds of 1 to 1, assuring very high casualties. MacArthur himself considered his staff's estimate of 55,000 losses for the first month too high for Olympic. Willoughby, writing in 1946, further elaborated that taking Kyushu alone could cost 200,000 American casualties. Clearing the Kanto Plain, he warned, could reach 400,000 more. General Hull, for his part, played a role in preparing low casualty estimates for Truman. He later resisted admitting the high price of an invasion strategy, relying on outdated projections despite the overwhelming ultra evidence. Stimson's own projection was stark: 20 Okinawas, he warned, amounting to nearly 1 million American casualties. While Allied leaders grappled with such projections, the Japanese leadership faced its own equally profound crisis. Their internal struggles mirrored the chaos of their disintegrating nation. Foreign Minister Togo conceded Japan's diplomatic initiative to the Soviet Union, hoping they would mediate an end to the war. Yet he explicitly rejected Ambassador Sato's advice to accept modified terms, even if it meant retaining the imperial institution. This occurred on July 22, 1945, as revealed by the Magic Far East Diplomatic Summary. The Big Six, as they were known, formulated terms for ending the war on August 9, 1945, but these were still unacceptable to the Allies. It was the word of Nagasaki's bombing that finally arrived, changing the bullish attitude of some leaders in that room. Army Minister Anami, along with Chiefs of Staff Umezu and Toyoda, insisted on maintaining the old order even after Japan's eventual surrender terms formulation. Vice Chief of the Imperial Army General Staff, Kawabe, his diary entries confirmed discussions about overseas legions not obeying surrender orders and the attempted coup d'état that followed. Premier Suzuki's assessment, however, emphasized that the atomic bomb made invasion unnecessary, thus fundamentally changing the calculus for peace. In the early morning of August 10, 1945, the Emperor announced his decision to surrender. citing the domestic situation, the atomic bomb's destructiveness, and inadequate military preparation. Later that same day, he met with senior military officers and reaffirmed his determination to end the war, now citing Soviet intervention and the enemy's scientific power. On August 14, 1945, the emperor wrote to his eldest son, reflecting on Japan's defeat, emphasizing an overconfidence in fighting spirit and a severe underestimation of science. By November 1945, the government estimated only 6,355,000 metric tons of rice available. The average daily diet was projected to be only 1,005 calories by February 1946, a figure that later proved optimistic. Daily averages had already sunk to 1,680 by 1945. Japan's rice production had plummeted from 10,027,474 metric tons in 1942 to 8,783,827 tons in 1945. This meant 20 to 25% of the urban population suffered nutritional deficiencies by war's end. The consequences of strategic air attack and naval blockade alone threatened mass famine, potentially causing more loss of life than even the atomic bombs. This desperate internal situation, a looming spectre of mass starvation, was a critical, possibly sufficient catalyst for Japan's surrender, independent of the atomic bombs. The destruction of Japan's transportation network, particularly its railways, presented a more immediate and catastrophic threat of internal collapse and mass starvation than commonly acknowledged. Japan's pre-war dependency on coastal shipping for internal transport meant the crippling of its merchant marine by Allied forces left it acutely dependent on its already vulnerable railway system. An August 11th targeting directive, focusing on rail yards and bridges, was a potent weapon that could have effectively dismantled Japan's ability to distribute essential commodities like food. American planners, however, possessed a significantly better understanding of Japan's food shortages and its reliance on rail transport after the war than during it. This led to critical miscalculations about the true impact of bombing. The fear of internal upheaval due to starvation and collapse created a critical fault line between military leaders focused on external defense and civilian leaders, including the emperor, who feared internal revolt. The systematic destruction of Japanese merchant vessels rendered internal sea transport unreliable, forcing an over-reliance on railways. The August 11th air targeting directive, specifically targeting the rail system, represented a potent to trigger widespread crisis. This analysis suggests that the atomic bombs, while significant, may not have been the sole or even primary driver of surrender. Conventional strategic bombing of infrastructure could have achieved a similar outcome, albeit with different human costs. The text argues against the certainty that Japan would only have surrendered due to the atomic bombs, presenting the rail system's vulnerability as a powerful alternative catalyst. It challenges the Strategic Bombing Survey's definitive surrender date, noting that Japanese leaders' testimony didn't fully support this, and that the survey overlooked key strategic developments like the rail targeting. Government requisitions for the fall harvest stood at only 60% of quotas. Daily shipments to Tokyo fell to one-third of need in spring 1946. The official daily ration in Tokyo stood at 1,042 calories, but actual issuance averaged a mere 800 calories. A crowd of 150,000 demonstrated at the Imperial Palace for emergency rations. Historian Daikichi Irakawa estimated hundreds of thousands died from sickness and physical deterioration, classified as starvation deaths. Japan had only 4 days of rice consumption in government hands by November 1, 1945. The destruction of the rail transportation system would have posed a severe threat to internal order. The primitive Japanese highway system, 97% unpaved, was incapable of sustaining serious movement of goods. Magic diplomatic summaries provided evidence of food shortage, but were susceptible to misinterpretation by U.S. intelligence. While some evidence indicated food shortages by March to June 1945, a military intelligence service assessment on June 30th still concluded no serious overall food shortage. However, by August 8th, a Far East summary noted Japan's war economy's heavy dependence on rail movement. The new air targeting directive of August 11th promised to shatter Japan's rail system, with 54 railroad yards and facilities and 13 bridges specifically listed. The Kanmon Tunnel and rail ferries, Key links between Honshu and Kyushu and Hokkaido were especially vulnerable to blocking. MacArthur, in January, warned of desperate peril. He later silenced skeptics questioning US aid by highlighting the need for allies to set a higher standard than Japanese war crimes trials in treating prisoners. Herbert Hoover, heading an investigative commission, validated Japan's food crisis and recommended significant further shipments. His validation underscored the dire situation despite initial skepticism in Washington. Ultimately, 800,000 tons of food were shipped to Japan by the United States during the year following the war, preventing immediate mass starvation. But before the specter of famine became paramount, another kind of destruction had already ravaged Japan's cities. The night of March 9–10, 1945, saw a pivotal and devastating event: the firebombing of Tokyo. Despite its immense destruction and loss of life, it did not fundamentally alter Emperor Hirohito's strategic calculus to fight on until a decisive battle. This highlights the complex factors influencing Japan's eventual surrender. The raid was a product of the evolving USA air strategy against Japan, shifting towards widespread incendiary attacks on urban centers to maximize destruction and break civilian morale. The inherent inflammability of Japanese urban construction, coupled with ineffective firebreak strategies, made Tokyo exceptionally vulnerable to such attacks. B-29s, flying low, unleashed incendiary munitions that appeared like strings of fiery Christmas tree lights to survivors. Kimiono recalled people's clothes were on fire. Masatake Bata described how the entire river surface was engulfed. Survivors like Hidezo Tachikura and Kinosuke Wakabayashi appeared like ghosts in the aftermath. The inadequate air raid protection facilities in Tokyo were overwhelmed. The decision for partial evacuation and the establishment of firebreaks proved futile. The raid unleashed a firestorm phenomenon, where intense fires merged, creating their own wind system that exacerbated the destruction. This was the reality of black snow and leaping tigers. Over 90,000 people died, with some estimates reaching 100,000, comparable to the death tolls at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Material destruction in Tokyo was catastrophic. Yet, after touring the devastated areas, Emperor Hirohito's resolve to continue fighting, to seek a decisive battle, remained strong. While some argue this event did influence his decision for peace, the immediate impact was not one of capitulation. The firebombing of Tokyo was a brutal demonstration of a sophisticated and often misunderstood evolution in strategic air power. The development and application of strategic air power, particularly by the Luftwaffe and the American Air Forces, were far more complex and sophisticated than commonly perceived. It challenges narratives that attribute strategic air warfare solely to Anglo-American efforts or portray German air doctrine as purely tactical. The myth that the Luftwaffe was solely focused on tactical operations is incorrect. Early Luftwaffe development showed equal interest in strategic attack, influenced by Europe's strategic placement, resource availability, and practical experience in Spain. At the outbreak of World War II, the Luftwaffe was the most sophisticated air force in the world, in both tactical and strategic bombing doctrine and equipment, as historian Coram explains. So the idea that only England and America seriously developed strategic air warfare is a myth. Pre-war expectations for precision bombing were undermined by operational experience in locations like Pantelleria, Rome, and the Balkans, revealing the limitations of precision under combat conditions. The RAF's night area bombing doctrine, driven by the need to inflict damage on German industry and morale, contrasted with the US daylight precision bombing approach. But both evolved under pressure. The U.S. Army Air Force's strategic bombing doctrine was heavily influenced by civilian and military leadership's embrace of Dauphin war, unrestricted bombing of civilians. This led to increasingly destructive campaigns against Japan. Curtis LeMay's command of the ex-Peon Bomber Command marked a decisive shift in the Pacific Air War. He moved towards low-altitude incendiary attacks, based on his operational experience and a pragmatic assessment of existing methods. LeMay himself claimed the low-altitude aspect was my own thinking. Operational experience showed the fallacy of pre-war expectations for precision bombing. Approximately 26,415 tons of bombs were dropped on Bulgaria and Romania alone. Dependence on radar aids became critical, as only about 5 days per month permitted visual bombing. The all-weather program of radar allowed for 5 times that tempo. The moral paradox of this shift was supported by the country's top civilian and military leaders, including Arnold, Marshall, Eisenhower, Stimson, Lovett, and Roosevelt. LeMay made the radical decision to strip B-29s of defensive guns to increase bomb load, despite concerns about light flak. The M69 incendiary became a key weapon in these attacks. The Nagoya raid in February 1945, for example, showed that while factories were hit, 94% of the factory's machine tools were still serviceable. The Tokyo raid of March 9, 1945, destroyed over 15.1 square miles. By late March 1945, LeMay even ran out of incendiaries, necessitating emergency orders. The USSBS identified the impact of air attacks on Japanese urban economies, confirming widespread destruction. The capture of Iwo Jima provided a crucial landing strip for damaged B-29s, potentially saving thousands of lives. Yet, air power was only one facet of a multifaceted Allied strategy systematically strangling Japan. The less dramatic, but equally devastating, naval blockade and extensive mine warfare played an often understated, yet decisive role. Japan's defeat was not solely due to the atomic bomb, but a result of a comprehensive and relentless Allied strategy, primarily the naval blockade and extensive mine warfare, which systematically crippled its war economy and ability to import vital resources. The systematic severing of Japanese shipping routes by Allied naval and air forces directly led to a severe decline in imports of essential war materials, particularly oil. Japan's economic structure was fundamentally reliant on imported raw materials, making it acutely vulnerable to blockades and shipping interdiction. The offensive mine-laying campaign against Japan's merchant marine began to systematically isolate the home islands. The cutoff of oil imports had devastating consequences for Japan's war machine and economy. Japanese officers recalled the time taken to develop countermeasures: 1 month for the needle-type magnetic mine, 2 months for the ship propeller acoustic mine, and 3 months for the hull vibration acoustic mine and pressure mine. Bested no counter was ever found for the latter two. Munitions Minister Tejiro Toyoda stated, "The shipping shortage and the scarcity of oil were the two main factors that assumed the utmost importance in Japan's war effort." Japan's oil needs represented a significant portion of its imports. Aircraft manufacturing was severely affected by the blockade, with collapsing aircraft production cited. Minister of State National Power Analysis stated Japan's food situation could only sustain the war for 1 year. Ultra-intelligence facilitated the mine campaign, along with minefield charts purloined from sunken vessels. Behind the scenes of this strategic strangulation, American intelligence, through the Magic Intercepts, was piecing together a continuous stream of information about Japan's deteriorating internal situation. This intelligence revealed a trajectory of change, contradicting simplistic narratives and highlighting the complex decision-making processes within Japan. American success in decryption, known as MAGIC, was a key driver in understanding Japan's internal state and intentions. Japan's deteriorating internal situation, evident in intercepted communications, created pressure for them to seek an end to the war. Internal divisions within Japan, particularly between military and civilian leadership, complicated any unified approach to peace. The existence and utilization of MAGIC intercepts provided crucial, often overlooked, insight into Japan's internal discussions and a clear trajectory of change. Specific diplomatic overtures and communications from Japan, deciphered by MAGIC, indicated their growing desperation and search for a negotiated exit from the war, even with conditional terms of surrender. The MAGIC intercepts are presented as evidence against the myth that Japan was entirely unified and unwavering in its commitment to fight to the bitter end. The text reveals internal debates and anxieties about the war's outcome. MAGIC intercepted messages from 30 governments or equivalents, revealing unrelieved pessimism on all aspects by January 1945. By June 1945, messages showed, "Japan does not expect to win." Prince Konu, a known pacifist, refused to join the government, a detail noted in intercepts. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, Ambassador Onodera, and Minister Cass were all involved in diplomatic discussions. Okamoto, for instance, reported a contact through Swedish Minister Bagge for negotiations with the United States, messages regarding peace feelers at the Vatican, and from former Japanese Minister Hirota further underscored this desperation. These extensive intercepts provided a much richer understanding of Japan's internal situation than previously acknowledged. Understanding these internal divisions and the relentless external pressure brings us back to the stark reality of the Allied invasion planning. The potential human cost loomed large. The text details the complex and often contentious planning and considerations surrounding the potential Allied invasion of Japan in 1945. It highlights the strategic debates, casualty projections, and evolving operational plans, suggesting that the ultimate decision to use the atomic bomb was influenced by a confluence of these factors, particularly the projected human cost of an invasion. The anticipated difficulty of defeating Japan on its home islands drove the refinement of casualty projection models based on previous combat experience in both Pacific and European theaters. Divergent interpretations and objections to casualty figures, particularly from Admiral King, who questioned the methodology and its implications for naval strategy, marked these debates. The JCS's adoption of the invasion strategy recommendation, JCS 1924-15, came despite King's objections. The June 18, 1945, meeting at the White House was a crucial strategic discussion where casualty figures and invasion feasibility were debated. Marshall's June 15, 1945, memorandum to Truman regarding ending the Japanese War was central, forwarded by Stimson the next day. The text implicitly challenges the notion that casualty projections were universally accepted or without controversy. Highlighting Admiral King's specific objections, he famously stated it would be a particular mistake to support the invasion strategy with the quoted figures on casualty. Because of the many differences in the character of combat and enemies in the two theaters, such a comparison of casualties proves nothing. Projected casualties ranged widely, 476,560 total casualties based on Pacific experience versus 138,052 based on European experience. The ratio of killed to wounded or injured was approximately 4.5 to 1 in the Army ground branches. Naval and air combat losses were also high. 53% of 69,242 Navy casualties were killed in action. Army Air Forces suffered 115,382 battle casualties, of which 45% were deaths. Admiral King's headquarters compiled a mysterious tally of these grim numbers. General Hull expressed being very much perturbed by casualty projection figures. Marshall even made persistent efforts to have the JCS and the President consider the use of gas warfare. The 31,000 inches casualty estimate for the first 30 days of an invasion was presented, but its accuracy and presentation were debated. But while the Allies meticulously planned for an apocalyptic defense, their military, despite overwhelming American military and industrial superiority, was desperately preparing for a final, bloody defense of the homeland, specifically Kyushu, with plans that prioritized delaying tactics and inflicting maximum casualties over realistic victory scenarios. The ingrained Japanese military doctrine of seeking a decisive battle to inflict unbearable losses on the enemy, forcing a negotiated peace, drove the preparations for the defense of Kyushu. The brutal fighting on Okinawa served as a stark warning and catalyst, intensifying Japanese preparations for an even more ferocious defense on Kyushu. Imperial headquarters' hesitancy to commit crucial reserves like the 36th Army to Kyushu was attributed to a lack of accurate intelligence regarding American plans. The detailed notes on intelligence failures, resource shortages, and internal debates about troop deployment suggest that even at the highest levels, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty and strategic improvisation, not just unwavering, blind faith. The 16th Area Army Plan divided Kyushu into specific operational areas. Original reinforcement plans called for 3 to 5 divisions, but contemporaneous plans at IEGHQ reflected 4 reinforcing divisions. Lieutenant General Side T. Horace Bondare commented that lack of sound intelligence prevented Imperial headquarters from deciding to dispatch troops to the Kyushu area. Japanese anti-tank guns like the Type 94-37 gun had a penetration capability of only 24-37 mm at 400 yards, significantly inferior to American tank armor. Ammunition stockpiles were limited, with some units having only 1.0 Keisenbahn, a unit equivalent to roughly 2,500 to 4,000 metric tons. Imperial Army had only 59,000 kiloliters of fuel on hand. At the end of July had only 59,000 kiloliters of fuel. The decisive battle doctrine, known as Ketsu Operation, was their only hope. This was not merely a conventional defense. It was a desperate, increasingly irrational preparation for national suicide. Japan's desperate and increasingly irrational preparations for homeland defense, particularly the Ketsu Operation, reveal a leadership clinging to a suicidal strategy of inflicting maximum casualties in a final decisive battle rather than accepting defeat. This strategy was characterized by a reliance on mass suicide attacks and the mobilization of an entire populace. A severe fuel shortage critically hampered Japanese air operations and training, forcing a shift towards suicide attacks. A deep-seated ideology of national suicide and a desire to inflict heavy losses on the enemy to achieve a more honorable peace drove Japanese decision-making. The realization by Japanese leadership that air superiority was unattainable led to the conversion of training units and pilots. The comprehensive mobilization of civilians, including training them for combat, was a last-ditch defense measure. The Imperial Navy's official estimate was that only 1 in 6 suicide attacks would score a hit. The Imperial Army was more optimistic. 1 to 1.5 hits out of a 6-plane unit. Lieutenant Colonel Koji Tanaka agreed that assembling massive waves of attackers was beyond realistic Japanese capabilities and that achieving air superiority was impossible. Major General Kazuo Tanikawa wholly discounted the ability of Japanese fighters to establish any air superiority. Minister Anami, however, expressed confidence in the prospects for Ketsu-go, hoping to inflict a heavy blow to negotiate a peace. Non-aerial suicide weapons were also developed, including the Water's Edge Surprise Attack Force, noted on July 17, 1945. U-Ultra-intelligence detected Japanese mobilization and provided detailed unit information, including photographic evidence of dispersal and conceal programs. Amidst these frantic preparations for a final catastrophic confrontation, the debate over Japan's surrender terms and the fate of its emperor raged fiercely behind closed doors. The official discourse surrounding the unconditional surrender of Japan and the decision to use the atomic bomb often masks a more complex and nuanced reality of internal deliberations, diplomatic maneuvering, and evolving understandings of the war's end. The specter of a costly invasion of Japan, Operation Olympic, was a significant driver for seeking an expedited end to the war. The availability of the atomic bomb introduced a new variable, seen by some as a tool to shorten the war and by others as leverage for post-war geopolitical aims. The Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26, 1945, and the Japanese response, or lack thereof, led to further escalation. The text implicitly questions the absolute inflexibility of the unconditional surrender demand by pointing to discussions about potential concessions, particularly regarding the emperor's status. It challenges the simplistic narrative that the atomic bomb was the only way to end the war quickly and avoid an invasion. Joseph C. Grew, a recognized authority on Japan, engaged in discussions with Truman about surrender terms. His memorandum of conversation with Truman on May 28, 1945, revealed these evolving views. Stimson's diary, on July 2, 1945, reveals evolving thinking on the surrender formula and the potential benefits of the atomic bomb. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo's flat rejection of a proposal was noted in diplomatic summaries. Premier Suzuki's public rejection of the Potsdam Declaration, using the term mokusatsu, also proved controversial. The magic diplomatic summaries revealed a significant volume of intercepted communications, over 2,000 summaries, showing Japan's internal debates. The Big Six, Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, never agreed to terms. A document known as Essentials of Peace Negotiations outlined Japanese conditions for peace, emphasizing the preservation of the imperial line. This intricate dance of diplomacy and destruction was playing out against the backdrop of a new and terrifying weapon and the looming shadow of Soviet intervention. The decision to use the atomic bomb was driven by complex political considerations, primarily the desire to shape the post-war Soviet-American relationship rather than solely by military necessity to end the war quickly. Roosevelt's policy of fostering Soviet trust, while simultaneously withholding the atomic secret, suggests a deliberate strategy to leverage the bomb's political power. The May 31st, 1945, Interim Committee meeting represented a critical juncture where alternatives to the bomb's use were, however, briefly considered. The Frank Report's call for a demonstration and the Science Panel's recommendation for immediate use highlight the internal debate and differing scientific perspectives on the bomb's deployment. Henry L. Stimson articulated the strategy of shock and noted the bomb's political implications in relation to the Soviets. Leo Szilard, a key figure in the bomb's development, advocated for a demonstration, and his concerns about a post-war nuclear arms race with Russia were noted. General Marshall confirmed the strategy of shock and considered using poison gas against Japanese forces. The gun-type bomb mechanism of Little Boy was a terrifying new technology. On July 25, 1945, Truman's Potsdam diary entry reflected his thoughts on the bomb. The text strongly suggests that Japan's decision to surrender was not a singular event triggered by the atomic bombings alone, but rather a complex confluence of factors, with the Soviet Union's declaration of war acting as a critical catalyst that finally broke the military hardliners' resistance. The initial Soviet invasion of Manchuria, a massive and unexpected offensive, drastically altered Japan's strategic calculations. The atomic bombings, while devastating, initially failed to sway the most entrenched military faction who sought continued resistance. The Soviet Union declaring war on Japan and launching its invasion of Manchuria fundamentally shifted the perceived strategic landscape for Japan. The Emperor's personal intervention to break the deadlock within the Supreme Council and force a decision for surrender was the ultimate turning point. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched its invasion of Manchuria. General Edward J. Dreher's work on Japanese intelligence highlights their miscalculations and missed signals. The devastating impact of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred just before and during this invasion. On August 9, 1945, the atomic bombing of Nagasaki occurred. Intense meetings and deliberations within the Japanese Supreme Council and with the Emperor ensued on August 9-10. Prime Minister Suzuki was portrayed as vacillating, struggling to manage the conflicting factions. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo advocated for peace and presented a clear stance to the Emperor. General Anami represented the hardline military opposition to surrender. Vice Admiral Zenshiro Hoshina's observations highlighted the sharp division in the Navy's stance. The Emperor's explicit linking of the atomic bomb and the Soviet invasion in his reasoning for surrender was crucial. On August 10, 1945, the Emperor announced his decision to surrender. The Soviet attack on Manchuria was all out, characterized by its rapid advance and large scale, crossing vast marshy terrain to seize Halar, Solon, Chitsaha, and Harbin. The Emperor's decision, however, did not immediately quiet the voices of resistance. The final act of surrender was fraught with internal conspiracy and a strategic Japan's post-war identity. The text strongly suggests that Japan's decision to surrender was a complex internal struggle, driven by a confluence of factors including the devastating impact of atomic bombs, the Soviet declaration of war, and a growing realization within leadership of the futility of continued resistance, despite significant internal divisions and resistance to surrender. The Allied warning to Germany about POW welfare in April 1945 was paralleled by a draft warning to Japan due to deteriorating POW conditions. Verified Japanese atrocity stories contributed to a harsher stance. The strategic decision by U.S. occupation authorities to keep the Emperor's status vague leveraged this to encourage elite cooperation with reform. The U.S. decision to delay clarity on the Emperor's fate was a pivotal strategic choice for the occupation. The imperial conferences and cabinet meetings, where surrender was debated and ultimately decided, highlighted the intense internal conflict. General Marshall was involved in drafting a warning to Japan. Byrne's note quoted regarding the lack of guarantee for the Emperor's status. Anami, a key figure in the army ministry representing resistance to surrender, had a close personal affinity for the Emperor. General Kuwabe expressed significant regret and realizations of the army's failures. Stimson's diary entry on August 10, 1945, referenced the projected casualty figures for an invasion, estimated at a score of bloody Iwo Jimas and Okinawas. Iwo Jima alone saw 8,586 American combat deaths and Okinawa 12,520, with total casualties of 31,700 and 1,733 respectively. Lieutenant Colonel Hatanaka and Colonel Saburo Hayashi were key figures in coup plotting, convinced that the Japanese race would be wiped out. Prince Makasa's lacerating lecture to an army highlights the deep rifts within the elite. The potential for a coup d'état was a significant internal threat. The incident at Atsugi illustrates the continued defiance within parts of the military, even as surrender loomed. Japan's decision to surrender was driven by a complex interplay of fears of internal collapse and military defeat, with the atomic bombings and Soviet intervention acting as catalysts that undermined the premise of prolonged resistance. The common narrative of the atomic bomb being the sole decisive factor is incomplete. The internal situation in Japan, specifically the fear of revolutionary civil disorder and the collapse of public morale, was a key consideration for the emperor and senior leaders. The perceived inevitability of military defeat was exacerbated by the collapse of Japan's merchant marine, its ability to import food, and its internal transportation systems. The Kono Memorial in February 1945 was a stark warning to the throne that internal revolution posed a greater threat than military defeat. Imperial conferences from June to August 1945 explicitly referenced the present state of national power and the fear of internal disorder. Hiranuma's direct warning of greater domestic disturbances from continuing the war was crucial. The atomic bombings of August 6 and 9, 1945, demonstrably had a very great effect upon public sentiment and nullified everything according to contemporary observers. The myth that public opinion had virtually no impact is debunked by evidence showing the fear of civil disorder was a key consideration. The Kwantung Army, far from being Japan's premier fighting force, had been written off by imperial headquarters and stripped of vital resources. Navy Minister Yonai expressed anxiety over the domestic situation as the impelling factor for ending the war. His aide, Admiral Takagi, was privy to his anxieties. The emperor identified loss of faith in the military as the basis for his decision and cited domestic considerations. Togo hinted at fear of internal disorder in a July 11th message. An army conceded spreading defeatism on August 9th. Suzuki explicitly endorsed Hiranuma's proposition about domestic disturbances. General Kawabe confessed in his diary that the atomic bomb and Soviet declaration were shocks in quick succession. Toyoda acknowledged the atomic bomb's very great effect upon public sentiment. Japan's merchant marine totaled 369,314 tons lost in June, and 349,449,449,449,449,449,000. Japan's 171,1925 in July 1945. Its rail system, one of the most vulnerable, had the Tokaido-Sanyo line alone passing through about 150 bridges and some 30 tunnels. Japan faced a disastrous rice harvest in 1945, only 6.6 million metric tons compared to over 10 million in prior years. Its government calculated possession of only 440,000 tons of seaworthy vessels. By September 9, 1945, the Magic Diplomatic Summary and Magic Far East Summary were crucial sources, revealing the eyes and ears of the throne. This complex tapestry of human suffering but KS2 was crucial, and strategic calculation and desperate measures remains one of the most debated and morally complex acts of the 20th century, its true cost and implications still echoing through history. Yet, understanding that echo is a monumental challenge. A significant portion of original Japanese documentation was irrevocably lost. Deliberate efforts to obscure truth led to the destruction of records in 1945. This act created irretrievable damage to the historical record. Accounts provided by Japanese officials, often given soon after the war, are inherently biased. These narratives are frequently self-serving, requiring careful critical examination. The precise extent of Emperor Hirohito's involvement and decision-making remains unclear. No dedicated investigation by the occupation forces fully addressed this ambiguity. His translated statement, prepared in March and April 1946, offers crucial but filtered insight. To uncover a more coherent understanding, historians rely on robust historical reconstruction. This process involves collating translated official histories and personal statements. It also integrates meticulously declassified American intelligence documents. This methodology forms the foundation for reinterpretation. A cornerstone is the official Japanese military history series, the Boecho Boei Kenshujo Senshi Shitsu, or War History series, comprises over 100 volumes. Specific translations from this series are vital for insights into Japanese military perspective. These include volumes on policy making at Imperial General Headquarters. Also, Home Air Defense Operations reveals the desperate defensive struggle. Preparations for the decisive battle on the homeland, defense of the Kyushu area details anticipated invasion, and Army Division, the Imperial General Headquarters, Vol. 10, illuminates internal strategic thought. These detailed accounts are cross-referenced with declassified American radio intelligence documents. These documents provided the Allies with the eyes and ears of the throne. Such rigorous examination implicitly challenges the idea of a complete and unbiased record. It debunks the myth that Japan's wartime actions are fully transparent. Instead, it highlights active efforts to obscure truth, not merely passive loss. Institutions like the Imperial General Headquarters were the nerve centers of policy. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted exhaustive post-war analysis. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East gathered critical testimonies. Even figures like Admiral Donitz, from a different theater, put their wartime actions under scrutiny. This complex collation of sources ultimately strives for a more accurate narrative. It seeks to clarify the role of key figures, particularly Emperor Hirohito. It acknowledges the profound consequences of a deliberately distorted historical memory.